Well, thanks a lot, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks to Philippe and Alain and everybody else for putting this program together. Obviously, I have very mixed feelings about being here. It's nice to be here to memorialize Emmanuel, but at the same time, of course, we wish that he was here with us. This paper is called Entry versus Rents, Aggregation with Economies of Scale. It's a paper that Emmanuel and I had worked on. We were working on this just as COVID hit. And so it has Emmanuel's fingerprints all over it. It's a pleasure to present it here today. So please go ahead and interrupt. I think this is the sort of paper that will benefit from clarifying questions and other kinds of questions as I'm presenting it, rather than something to wait for to ask your questions at the end. So this paper is part of this research agenda that I shared with Emmanuel. We wrote lots of different papers about related topics. And overall in this research agenda, the thing that we tried to do was we tried to understand how to think about aggregating, explicitly aggregating complicated economies that had lots of disaggregated details about the production structure, so that we could understand the behavior of aggregate variables by explicitly thinking about how to go from the micro level production units up to the macro level objects that we construct in the data. So this paper is part of that research agenda. We were thinking about how should we think about the aggregation of technological disturbances and the aggregation of changes in distortions, and ask questions like, what is the impact of misallocation on aggregate output in an economy that had a well-founded theory of the optimal scale of production units, in an economy where there's an active entry and exit margin and there's potentially decreasing or increasing returns to scale. So our starting point for thinking about these kinds of problems is always to think about what the benchmark answer to the sorts of questions we're asking is in the quote-unquote standard theory. So the standard theory here, I mean a perfectly competitive Arrow-Debreu economy where the first welfare theorem holds. In that kind of framework, if you're thinking about how a change in some distortion, a change in some wedge, or a change in a technology parameter is going to affect aggregate output, the answer turns out to be very simple. So here, aggregate output, I'm denoting by big Y. You can think of this as real GDP in some complicated economy. And if you think about perturbing a productivity parameter, let's say the TFP of some producer in your economy, the producer I'm labeling by K, if you change their productivity parameter AK, then the response on output is given by the sales of that producer as a share of GDP. So this is, of course, the famous Halton result that a lot of our research built on. And the idea here is that in the standard perfectly competitive Arrow-Debreu economy, the details of the production structure don't matter directly for thinking about aggregate output if you have access to the sales shares. All the information that you could care about is sort of encapsulated in this sales share. Furthermore, so this is how the economy responds to technology shocks. Furthermore, if you think about introducing a wedge in this economy, so a gap between price and marginal cost for some producer K, then the way that's going to affect real GDP is zero. Why? Because when you introduce a wedge into your economy, it reallocates resources and activity. But if the envelope theorem holds, if the first welfare theorem holds, and you were optimizing before the shock, then you're not going to have any effect on aggregate output in this economy. And finally, of course, the envelope theorem or the first welfare theorem also tells us that there's no misallocation in the perfectly competitive Arrow-Debreu economy because you're on the efficient frontier. So what we want to do in this paper is we want to understand what happens with entry. We want to be able to answer these three questions. How does output respond to technology shocks? How does output respond to a change in wedges? And what's the distance to the frontier in an environment where you have fixed costs, you have entry and exit margin operating. So just to kind of give it away, the entry margin turns out to really matter quantitatively and qualitatively. It really changes the way that these economies respond to shocks. Just to give you an example, if you think about the distance to the frontier, if you incorporate the entry margin, it can have sort of a doubling effect on the distance to the frontier. So it's a margin that matters, and it's important to understand how it works. So the idea of this paper is we want to come up with a general theory of aggregation with entry, and we want it to kind of work across a large class of models so that we can feel like we understand kind of the deep forces that matter in these kinds of questions. So we want to be able to account for things like input-output connections across producers. We want to account for the idea that entry can be targeted or untargeted. So for example, by targeted entry, I mean that you could think about starting up a business that produces ice cream or starting up a business that produces cars. Targeted means you know what you're going to get when you pay the entry cost. You could either pay an entry cost and start up the ice cream business, or pay the entry cost and start up the auto producer. Or it could be untargeted, which is when you pay an entry cost to start making ice cream, maybe you don't know how good you are at making ice cream, and there's different kinds of ice cream, and you could be a good ice cream producer or a bad ice cream producer. We want to be able to handle both of these at the same time, and we want to handle arbitrary kind of substitution elasticities, complementarities, wedges, and increasing or decreasing returns to scale. And we're going to think about characterizing comparative statics with respect to technology and wedges, and think about first and second best policy and distance to the frontier. So to start with, our economy is going to have three types of agents. We're going to have entrants, producers, and households. These are the three types of agents. And then the primitives that we're going to be thinking about doing comparative statics with respect to are technology shifters and changes in wedges. So how does the economy work? So to start with, we've got these entrants. There are different types of entrants, which I'm going to index by J. And each entrant gets the option, if they want, to pay an entry cost. And if they pay the entry cost, then they get to draw a technology. So if you're an entrant of type J and you pay your entry cost, and the entry cost could be denominated in units of goods or in units of primary factors, then you get to draw from this distribution, zeta, which tells you if you're an entrant of type J, what kind of product are you likely to end up making in equilibrium. So you could think of this zeta as being, for example, a diagonal matrix. In that case, each entrant knows exactly what kind of good they're going to end up making in equilibrium. Or it could be something that's non-diagonal, so that there could be some mixture of different productivities that you draw. Once you become a producer of a given type, so let's say type I, then you get to produce using a production function, which is neoclassical in nature. So this Fi is the production technology for making good I. And the way you make good I is you assemble intermediate inputs from the rest of the producers in the economy, where here the J index is saying that producer I is buying something from J, where J could be another producer, or it could be a primary factor, so labor or capital. And then AI here is going to be our technology shifter. And then if you're a producer of type I, you also charge a markup over your marginal cost that's given by mu. Now, the producers of type I are aggregated together using an industry level aggregator. So if you're making a variety of a good type I, then you get aggregated with all the other producers of type I. So M here is the number of producers of type I, to give you kind of the industry level object, which is big Y. And big Y is the good that everybody in the economy who wants to buy good I is going to purchase. And then we assume that there's some gap between price and marginal cost for this industry level aggregator as well. So that's the production and entry side. Please, Ivan.
So within each good I, they're all identical?
Within each good I, they're all identical. But then you can think that the entry technology could be mixing over different types. So when you are thinking about entering, you don't necessarily know that what type of producer you're going to be. But the way the demand structure works over the different varieties is that it's all identical. So if this F is CES, that's without loss of generality, because you can always kind of have another guy in between who, using the same CES nest, is mixing the different I's.
Right, you just call it a different industry.
Exactly, that's right. So this is an implicit equation that is implicitly pinning down big Y. So given little y and the m, you've implicitly pinned down big Y. And yeah, for people who are not familiar with this kind of production structure, this is called a Kimball aggregator. If this F is a power function, then this is CES. Okay, so this is the production and entry side, and then the household side is going to be kind of boring. The household, there's a representative household with a homothetic aggregator who is consuming the different types of goods that this economy produces with some utility function. And then there is a budget constraint that says you have to pay for these consumption goods using net rents. And what do I mean by net rents here? The rents could be Ricardian rents because there's some primary factors or something that are earning rents because they're scarce, or it could be monopolistic rents that are coming because of some kind of markup. And this kind of structure is pretty general. It nests lots of different popular models in the literature where people are thinking about entry and exit. Okay, so now we want to understand how an economy like this behaves when we want to think about misallocation or reallocation or the way it responds to shocks. So to start with, I'm going to think about the efficient benchmark because I think that's going to be very useful to understand the intuition of why things become complicated in general. Because the efficient benchmark has some very nice simple aggregation properties. So how do we think about the efficient benchmark in this economy? So consider the market for each individual good, each individual product variety. So if you're some producer little I, then you face a downward sloping demand curve. What does your downward sloping demand curve look like? The downward sloping demand curve says the relative quantity that you get to sell relative to all the other producers of your type depends on your relative price, where little p is the price that producer type I charges, and big P is the price of the overall bundle that you're competing with amongst all the other producers. And then this gamma here, so F prime, this is the derivative of that Kimball aggregator. That's giving you the shape of the demand curve that variety I faces. And then gamma here is a Lagrange multiplier that comes out of just the constraints of consumer optimization. Now it has a very good intuition I'm going to give you in a second, but so far you can think of it as just some Lagrange multiplier. So this is the demand curve that an individual variety of type I faces. On the other side, the production side, the supply side, is determined by what the marginal cost of the curve looks like. So the marginal cost curve of producing good I is just the derivative of the cost function of I with respect to quantity. And this might be some upward sloping function, or it could be constant if on the margin you have constant returns to scale. So here's what the market looks like for an individual variety. Here's that demand curve I talked about. Here is the marginal cost curve. And for this individual variety, if you think about the area under the demand curve, we can split it up into three regions. There is an area under the demand curve, which is also under the marginal cost curve. This we would think of as total variable cost of this producer I. Then there is an area above the marginal cost curve, but under the price at which the good is being sold, big B, which we think of as producer surplus. So if this firm was charging price equals marginal cost, so if it was on this point, then big B would be the profits that the firm would be making because of diminishing returns to scale. And then finally, there's some area under the demand curve which is above the price, and we think of this as consumer surplus. Now it turns out that in this economy, the ratio of A to A plus B plus C is given by that gamma that I introduced earlier. So the gamma that was inside the downward sloping demand curve is actually measuring for you the amount of consumer surplus relative to producer surplus and total variable cost. So this is sort of like what the consumer can get away with that the firm is not capturing directly. So here I'll give you some examples just to make this concrete. Imagine you write down a model in the tradition of Dixit-Stiglitz or Mellitz or Shea-Klenow. In those kinds of environments, you have a CES aggregator over varieties, which aggregate to give you the overall level of production. So here, the CES parameter is going to control this ratio here, which is the area under the demand curve relative to revenues generated by the firm. And so gamma here is going to control that. And we classically think of this as the quote-unquote love of variety effect. But what it really is just consumer surplus. You can also think about other kinds of models, which are in the tradition of Lucas, Hoppenheim, and Restuccio-Rogerson, where aggregation is linear, so all the goods are perfect substitutes, but you produce with some diminishing returns to scale. Well, in that case, what you end up with is that gamma is equal to 1. So there is no area under the demand curve that's not captured by the firm. So here it is for these Stiglitz type environments. You have a downward sloping demand curve, and oftentimes in those models, they have constant marginal cost. Here it is in the decreasing returns to scale kind of Hoppenheim world, where you have an upward sloping marginal cost curve and a flat demand curve. Now, why do you care about these things? Because it turns out they really matter if you want to think about efficiency. So in this economy, it turns out that the equilibrium is Pareto efficient if the markups that are being charged happen to take specific values. Specifically, the equilibrium is going to be efficient if the markup that the ith variety charges is equal to that gamma, which is the area under the demand curve relative to revenues that the firm collects. And then furthermore, you have to have kind of an offsetting negative markup for the industry level aggregators. So the industry level aggregators have to be charging a markup that undoes the markup of the individual varieties. So intuitively, what's going on is that allowing these firms to charge a markup gamma is letting them capture all the surplus that they're creating for the consumer by existing, and then having an offsetting markup for the industry level object cancels out the distortion that's caused by the markup in the first place. Okay? What's the difference between this markup and this markup? The difference is the markup at the firm level is going to the owner of the firm. So it's incentivizing product creation. Whereas this markup, which is being charged at the industry level, is something that's not going to the guy who starts the firm. That's just being paid for by the household. Okay? Now, of course, if you think about like the Hoppenheim kind of models, mu can be equal to 1 in those environments because there's no area under the demand curve. And then, of course, you don't need an offsetting markup. So the standard perfect competition world in a Hoppenheim world is going to be efficient. But in general, if you have some area under the demand curve, you're not going to get to efficiency. But at the same time, this kind of tells you where the efficient point is. So this is useful for thinking about things like how far are we from the efficient frontier if we have a decentralized economy. It also means that optimal policy, in some sense, in this economy is network independent. So you can just go one by one and fix these distortions and not worry about overflows on other markets. So this is going to be a very useful result for us. Primarily, one of the reasons it's useful is because it clarifies that aggregation in an efficient economy is going to be very straightforward in the usual way that we are used to in Arrow-Debreu. So comparative statics are going to be very Halton-esque or Domar-esque in this economy. So if you happen to be in this magical world where efficiency is maintained, then if you perturb the productivity of a given producer, then the way it's going to affect real GDP is just the sales of that producer as a share of GDP. So Halton's theorem is going to hold in this world even though you have fixed costs and entry margin. And you can even think about a kind of Halton result for fixed costs. So if you change the fixed costs of a given producer, how does that affect real GDP? Well, it's just how much you were spending on the fixed cost as a share of GDP. So these sales shares come back. And of course, this economy is not going to respond to a first order to changes in wedges or distortions because of efficiency. Okay, so now that we understand the efficient case, we want to think about the inefficient case. And this is going to clarify why the inefficient case, or more generally, the model with entry is going to be a more complex object to understand. The reason is because the equilibrium response of aggregates is going to be complicated by reallocation effects. So when you don't have efficiency, which remember is kind of a magical knife edge case here, so in general you shouldn't expect these kinds of economies to be efficient. When you don't have efficiency, every time you hit this economy with a shock, there's going to be reallocations of resources. And because you don't have efficiency, these are going to move output to a first order.
Just to clarify,
yeah.
That amazing result you had, the previous one, so that result, what you meant by the markup at the industry level, I mean, who's charging that? That would be like a tax, right? Yeah,
it's exactly like a tax. So because the industry level aggregators, you can think of them as
nobody's being a monopolist.
Exactly, that's right. This industry level aggregator is just sort of some technology that exists out there. Nobody's choosing to there's no active like decision to enter into that market.
Impossible without government policy.
Exactly. It's almost impossible that you would get this holding without government policy, unless you're in that Oppenheim world where gamma is 1, and then you don't have to worry about it. The other case where you can get efficiency, so this is sort of like a sufficient result. You could have some particular assumption on the technology such that it just happens to be efficient. Dixit-Stiglitz, exactly. Okay, great. So what we're going to do now is we're going to try to think about a decentralized economy where we don't have efficiency. And we're going to try to see what these reallocations are going to look like. So I'm going to allow for arbitrary wedges. So these wedges, they could be endogenous in the sense that they could be the markup that the firm actually wants to charge, or they could be just some arbitrary thing that you impose and you treat as being exogenous. So what do I mean by that? If I come back to this picture here, if you ask this firm, what is the markup that you would like to charge in equilibrium? The firm would pick a number that depends on the elasticity of the demand curve at that point where it happens to be selling. So of course, that means if you hit the economy with a shock and the firm moves up and down its demand curve, then it would change its markup endogenously depending on the curvature of the demand curve at that point. So that's one kind of wedge. But it could also be that it's just some exogenous thing that you impose because of some unmodeled distortion. So we think about economies that have these features. And then we're going to, for notational reasons, I'm going to split the markets into either kind of having the consumer surplus or the producer surplus, but not both at the same time. Now, this is for notation rather than for tractability. The reason I'm saying it's for notation is because remember, this is an economy where you can just like kind of compose these markets into each other. So like you have one market where you have some consumer surplus being produced, and then that's used as an input into a market that has some producer surplus being produced. So you can kind of break it into 2 steps and think about these one at a time. So I'm going to split the markets like this into 2 extreme cases. So basically by that I mean markets that either look like this or markets that look like this. So if you think about it, you could just have, this is like some bundle where you have some producer surplus, and then it gets plugged into this market where you now have some consumer surplus. Okay, great. Now it turns out to understand reallocation effects in this economy, what you need to get your head around is what's going on with rents and quasi-rents. So what do I mean by that? So think about some producer I. Producer I in this economy is going to make some rents, and the rents are going to depend on the profit margin of type I, which I'm going to denote by pi, and then the sales of type I as a share of GDP. So this pi, this profit margin, depends on returns to scale and the markup that the firm is charging. Now, if you're type I and you're making some profits, that's going to incentivize entry if it's possible to enter into your market. So I'm going to call lambda E, you can think of it as the entry cost, as being the entry costs that are being paid by entrants of type J. So the way to think about it is there's these firms that are making profits. So there's some vector of I, and each firm is making a different amount of profit. And then there's these entrants who are looking at the profit that firms are making, and they're choosing to pay the entry cost to try to capture these profits. So lambda E is going to be the entry cost. Now, we think of quasi-rents as the bit of rents that gets dissipated by these entry costs. So what are quasi-rents in this model? So quasi-rents in this model, so remember, the number of entrants is not necessarily equal to the number of products that you have. So you could have one entrant type, but n different products. So they're not the same dimensions. But the way you can think about quasi-rents in this model, it turns out, to be as a projection of rents on the entry matrix, like a linear projection. So if you're thinking about changes in entry costs being paid, where you distribute the entry costs being paid by J across the different types of producers that J then goes on to become, it turns out that that's exactly the projection of changes in rents on the entry matrix itself. So what do I mean by this? Basically, the way this model works is we're in some equilibrium. Now suddenly, type I starts making more profits, producer of type I. That means entry responds in like a least squares fashion, according to the entry technology. where the entrants are trying to enter to capture the profits that are being made. And if you have as many entry conditions as you have product types, they will exactly capture all of the profits. So you will replicate the firm. But if you have like one entry condition and n entrant types, then they're not going to exactly be able to capture all the rents, and you'll generate some pure rents from that. So I'm going to denote the kind of quasi-rents by this hat notation. You can kind of think of it like a regression. And so what we're going to have is we're going to have some quasi-rents. This is an increase in rents that's being entirely offset by entry costs. And then we're going to have some pure rents, which is an increase in rents that's not being offset by entry costs. And it turns out that these two objects are what you need to understand if you want to think about reallocations in this economy. So just to give you a little bit more intuition about how this thing works, suppose that the entry matrix is just 0. So you cannot enter in this economy. So everybody is an incumbent. Well, in that case, this projection is just 0. Because if you project a vector of profits on 0, you just get 0. So there's no quasi-rents, and everything that's being generated in this model is pure rents. Now think about what happens if this zeta is rank 1. So there's one entry condition, you can pay the entry condition, and then you get randomly assigned to be producers of different types. Well, in that case, what this entry quasi-rent thing is going to look like is just going to be the change in the average profits that are being made. So an individual producer becomes more profitable, but quasi-rent only goes up by the extent to which average profitability rises, not the profitability of that individual producer. So you can see that basically entry is not going to respond one for one to increases in profits. And then the other extreme is if zeta is full rank. So there's one entrant type for each product, in which case profitability changes are exactly offset by changes in rents, one for one, in every market. Okay, so now why do you care about these things? Because they matter for aggregation. So think about hitting this economy now with a vector of technology shocks. So there's a vector of technology shocks that hits the economy, and we want to understand how aggregate output responds. So the first thing that's going to happen is there's kind of a mechanical effect on output because you're changing technology. So imagine you freeze the allocation of resources at the initial level and you just scale up production. Well, what does that do? What that does is it just means you take the technology shock and you multiply it by something that we're calling cost-based sales shares. So these are kind of the equivalent of sales shares if you adjust for the fact that there's these gaps between marginal cost and prices, like a mechanical object. I'm not going to show you the formula for it, but you could think of it as basically very analogous to sales shares. It's something that depends on how much the consumer spends on different goods, and then how that money is, the costs are kind of split across other producers. So it's something that you construct from a Leontief inverse, basically. And this is the counterpart to like the Halton term I showed you. So if you have an efficient economy, this is the only thing you care about. This is that sales shares object. What happens if you don't have an efficient economy? Well, you get some extra effects. Where do these extra effects come from? They come from the fact that in equilibrium, resources get reallocated. You don't just mechanically increase all the production by initial amounts. In that case, you're going to get some reallocation effects, which depend on changes in pure rents and changes in quasi-rents. And it turns out that in the markets where you have decreasing returns to scale, you think about changes in pure rents. And in the markets where you have increasing returns to scale, you think about changes in quasi-rents. And so if you live in kind of like a Hoppenheim world, you kill that last term. If you live in a Dixit-Stiglitz world, you kill the second term. In general, you're going to have to think about both. Okay? Now, of course, this isn't a full solution, and unfortunately, given time constraints, I'm not going to be able to kind of walk you through the entire solution in terms of primitives. I'm instead going to give you some examples to try to build intuition. What I can say, first of all, though, is, of course, to solve the model, you need to understand changes in rents, because it's this endogenous object that's showing up here that we haven't solved for. And that depends on kind of the standard intuition that you would have for propagation of shocks in input-output economies, which is there's some backward linkages, there's some forward linkages, and you have to solve out for backward and forward linkages to figure out changes in profitability. And the paper has the details. Instead, what I want to do in the time that I have left is I want to give you some examples to build some intuition. So here's a simple economy, and I'm going to apply the formulas that I showed you to see how the economy behaves differently depending on what we assume about the entry margin. So here is our household, and it's buying n different types of goods, and all of these goods are being produced from labor. So the different types of goods are indexed by 1 through capital N, and the elasticity of substitution that the household has for consuming these different goods is called theta 0. So that's just some parameter. Now, what I want you to think about is how this economy responds if you have a vector of productivity shocks that hit it. So the different producers are going to be hit with some vector of productivity shocks, and we're going to think about how output responds. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to vary assumptions about returns to scale, and I'm going to vary assumptions about the entry margin. So I'm going to think about what if the economy was constant returns, decreasing returns a la Hoppenheim, or increasing returns a la Dixit-Stiglitz. And I'm going to think about what happens if there is no entry, or if there is entry, etc. So here's kind of the neoclassical version of this economy. So I'm going to assume every one of these producers is constant returns to scale, and that there is no entry margin. So how does output respond? Well, first, there is a pure technology effect, which I talked about earlier. So that's just sales share weighted changes in technologies. And then there's a reallocation effect. Now, because this is a model with out entry, that means all the rents are pure rents. So this effectively is the changes in pure rents in this economy. Now, what does it depend on? It depends on the covariance of the technology shocks and the initial markups. And it depends on the elasticity of substitution. So what's the intuition for what's going on? What's going on is, suppose that the technology shocks happen to favor the high markup guys in the economy. So that means that this covariance is negative. If the elasticity of substitution is greater than 1, then that's going to boost output relative to like the efficient benchmark that we're used to. Why is that? Because the technology shock hits the producers. The high markup guys have favorable technology shocks, so they expand relative to the low markup guys if the goods are substitutes. And this expansion on its own is beneficial. Why? Because the high markup guys have a higher marginal revenue product than the low markup guys. The high markup guys are the guys that are inefficiently too small. So them expanding is a good thing from a social perspective. It raises output. So this is the classic intuition that you have if you've been reading my previous papers with Emmanuel, or if you're very immersed in the misallocation literature. It's all about initial markups and the way that reallocations interact with the initial markups. Now let's see what happens if I open the door to entry. And the way I'm going to do it is a la Dixit-Stiglitz. So each one of these aggregators gets its own entry condition, with where you can pay labor, some labor, that's the fixed cost, and you get to be this type of producer. What happens? Well, here's the answer. You still get the same technology effect as before, the pure technology effect, but now the reallocations look very different. The first thing to notice is actually the initial markup is irrelevant. It doesn't matter what I make the initial markup. It just drops out of the problem. Whatever the initial markup is, it won't matter.
So well, David, here, yeah. In fact, the markups are exogenous. I mean, you could imagine models that we are working on where it depends very much on, you know, the growth process.
That's right.
What other firms have done.
Yes, that's right.
The second best firm
yep.
is.
Perfect. So this is, so thanks for that question, Philippe. So the first thing I should say is this is a second best result in the sense that you're thinking about what's the initial distortion, which is the markup is the initial distortion, and then you're thinking how does the reallocation affect those initial distortions. So that's the sense in which this is a second best result. But something that I actually didn't mention and I should have done.
So you know, that's right, could be that you have different sources of markup.
Yes.
And you might have markup for different reasons.
That's right.
And also markup can be affected not only by yourself, but
perfect.
by your next best competitor.
Perfect, perfect, perfect. So these are all excellent points you're raising. So the thing I want you to think about is I'm not saying this is a general purpose intuition that works in all models. What I'm saying is in this particular model, once you make the assumption that production looks like this, you actually don't care why the markup is there. In this model, the only thing that matters is the markup. That's sort of a sufficient condition now for the amount of inefficiency, because the only margin is production. like the production technology. And so the markup here is going to be a sufficient statistic for the distortions, and then how does that interact with the reallocation? Now you're right, what I have done here, and I wasn't clear enough, and I should have been, this is the sort of thing that Emmanuel would have made sure would not happen in a talk, is implicitly I'm also assuming that basically each of these nests is Dixit-Stiglitz. Or I'm assuming that the markup is exogenously determined. Now what you're saying is, of course, the markup could be endogenously determined. In that case, the way it would change the formula is you would get something extra here about the pass-through of marginal cost shocks into the price. So here I'm implicitly kind of assuming that part of the problem away for simplicity, but you're absolutely right that there would be an interaction with pass-through in that case. I'm sort of taking the simplest case where we hold the markup constant to understand the reallocation effect. Thanks a lot for asking that, though. Otherwise, this may be impossible to understand without that clarification. OK, so hopefully everybody's with me, though, on the intuition for this result. Now, the next result was to say, take that same economy. So this is like that Dixit-Stiglitz economy with some exogenous markup. And now think about the technology shock. And now the initial markup is irrelevant. You actually don't care what it is. You can make it whatever you want. The only thing that you care about is the covariance of this gamma parameter with the technology shocks. So is it the case that the guys who are getting the technology shocks are the guys who have a lot of consumer surplus relative to the guys who don't? Why is that? Well, it's because the reallocations that happen in this model are very different to the reallocations that happen in the other model. Because you have directed entry here, all the reallocation that takes place is on the extensive margin. Basically, when the shock hits, you're just going to like scale up some firms and reduce the amount, like the number of one firm type you have relative to other firm types. You don't touch the variable production margin. And so what that's going to do is it means you're just kind of comparing these different scale elasticities with one another in the amount of consumer surplus that's being generated. So this is sort of very shocking if you're used to thinking, well, I need to know something about the initial markups to understand how reallocation effects are going to work. In this model, that's no longer true. And we take that same model now, and instead of doing entry according to Dixit-Stiglitz, let's do entry according to Hoppenheim. So now we have decreasing returns to scale, but again, it's like each guy here has a decreasing returns to scale technology, and now entry is happening into each of these units. What happens? You just get a Halton-esque result. In this economy, the reallocation effects disappear. And again, the initial markups no longer matter. Why? Again, it's because what's going on is that you're replicating the firm types. And if you go back to these equations that I showed you, you can see why this is happening. So in the case where I had Dixit-Stiglitz entry, this term was zeros because there's no pure rents in that model, because this exactly equals this because you have targeted entry, so this term disappears. So all you care about is these profit ratios, how they're changing, and their covariance with the initial scale elasticities. That's where this term is coming from. On the other hand, when you have Hoppenheim entry, this term is 0 because gamma equals 1 in every market, and all you're thinking about is these pure rents. But because you have directed entry, the pure rents are all 0 too. So both terms disappear, and you just get the pure technology effect. So this is a model where really the kind of assumption you make about entry and scale elasticities completely changes the way this model responds to shocks. So I have only 10 minutes left. So in the remaining time that I have, I want to kind of show you some normative implications of this kind of analysis. So now let's think about, if you're thinking about misallocation, what the implications are for the way this affects the distance to the frontier for the economy. So I've shown you what the efficient outcome is in this model. The efficient outcome is you want to have a bunch of taxes that hit these magical values that allow each firm variety to charge a markup that's exactly equal to the amount of surplus it's generating for the consumer with an offsetting subsidy that cancels the markup. So suppose that so you need kind of these two instruments in general in order to get efficiency. Now suppose that we take an economy that starts at the efficient point, and then we perturb the markups away from the efficient values. So we start moving towards the inefficient values that maybe are our decentralized economy. Okay? And then what we want to understand is what are the losses to social welfare as we start moving away from the efficient point? How can we think about those objects? So that is to say, what is approximately the distance to the frontier, given the fact that our decentralized equilibrium is not the same as the efficient equilibrium? So I'm going to call the deviations from efficiency of the markups from those magic values that I showed you tau. And there's two types of taus, remember. There's the one that goes to the owners of the firm, and there's the ones that Yvonne was talking about, which are more like taxes that just the household has to pay for directly. And let's think about what are the social losses. Now, of course, to a first order, the losses are zero once you start at that efficient point, because that's the envelope theorem. But once the wedges start becoming bigger, you start getting some second order terms. These are kind of the Harberger triangles or the deadweight loss triangles that show up once you start introducing distortions into a model. Now, what are these deadweight loss triangles? So the deadweight loss triangles, it turns out there's two types of them. The first type are more neoclassical. They're the deadweight loss triangles associated with variable production. So what are these? These are, what is the size of the tax, sort of like the compound tax that you're charging. So this is the tax on individual varieties. This is the tax on the industry. What's the size of the compound tax? What's the deviation from efficiency? And then what is the change in the quantity, the micro level object for each variety? So this is change in tax times change in quantity divided by 2. That's a Harberger triangle in market I. And you add them up using the sales shares in each market. So this is a Harberger, sum of Harberger triangles weighted by sales shares. And this is sort of the neoclassical distortions. But in this economy, we're going to get some extra Harberger triangles. And these are Harberger triangles in the entry margin, which is what is the distortion in the taxes that you have from efficiency, and what is the deviation that causes in the mass of different product varieties that you have. And again, you add them up, you multiply by half, that kind of gives you a Harberger triangle, and you add them up using sales shares. So the fact that you've got these extra entry margins to screw up means that you're potentially adding a whole ton of misallocation relative to a model that didn't have that extra margin. So again, the formulas for these things in terms of primitives are in the paper. As you can imagine, for the whole complicated model, it can get pretty overwhelming. So instead, I'll give you just some simple examples to give you some intuition. Let's take that same model that we had. Let's take a one sector model with linear production using labor, and then think about what the distortions, what the distance to the frontier looks like in a simple one sector model. So this is like a Shake-Planout type exercise. If you don't have entry, the distortions are going to look, this should be familiar to you. They depend on the elasticity of substitution, and they depend on the variance in markups. So these are these terms here. If you solve them out for a one sector model, you get this equation here. So theta, the elasticity of substitution, shows up because the higher is the elasticity, the bigger is the change in quantity for a given change in the wedge. And you weight things by sales shares. And that's how you get this familiar formula, which is the weighted variance of the wedges times the elasticity of substitution. Notice here that the level of the wedge doesn't matter. So if you scale all the wedges by a common amount, it drops out. What matters is dispersion. That's the only thing that matters. Why? Because this is a model with inelastic labor supply. So the only thing you care about is how much of labor goes to the different producers. Thanks. What happens if you add the entry margin? Well, if you add the entry margin, you get an extra term. You get the variance, like you did before. So those are the Harberger triangles associated with variable production. But now you get some extra terms, which is like a bias term. So instead of just caring about variance, you now also care about the level of the wedge. On average, this wedge, how far is it from the efficient value? Which in this case would be like the Dixit-Stiglitz markups. And the square of that is what matters. So now, of course, you can see that this is going to make the losses bigger in some sense, because you're now also possibly screwing up another margin. So, okay. So I only have 5 minutes left, so I'll show you some quantitative stuff before I wrap up. So let's take this kind of model and let's think about what are, so the more complicated version of this model, and let's try to quantify what these Harberger triangles look like. So I'm going to take a model that I calibrate to the US economy. So I'm going to suppose, for lack of a better assumption, I'm going to assume that firm level markups are the only distortions in the economy. Of course, that's not the way the world works, but it's useful, I think, as a benchmark starting case. So we say, let's say firm level markups are the only distortions we have. And then let's try to estimate these firm level markups at the firm level. So we use CompuStat to try to measure these firm level markups. And then we're going to take a quantitative model where we think we take an economy with an input-output structure. So there's different industries. The industries are linked to one another. And then every industry consists of a bunch of firm types, where the firm types are basically the types of firms you see in CompuStat. So there's an entry condition for every industry. If you pay the entry cost, you get to be one of the firms in CompuStat. And then we pick some elasticities of substitution, which we think are reasonable. And then we try to compute basically what's the distance to the frontier. So here's kind of like the big, I think of this as being very stylized, but it sort of gives you a sense of the magnitudes we're dealing with here. So on the left panel, this is what I get if I turn off the entry margin. So I look at a model without an entry margin, and I think about the distance to the frontier caused by these markups. Now, the distance to the frontier, the first thing you notice, it does depend on scale elasticities. So if you have a model without entry but decreasing returns to scale, the distance to the frontier is smaller, that's here, compared to a model with constant returns to scale, because decreasing returns to scale basically means that quantities are not as elastic to changes in relative prices caused by the distortions. Because quantities aren't as elastic, the distortions caused by those wedges are smaller. But you can see,
yeah. Your competition in this model would discourage entry, or like you don't have kind of an escape competition effect here, because you don't have
no, because yeah,
so it's mainly competition discouraging entry.
So the way I'm thinking about this is I see an economy with some initial markups, and then I know what the efficient values have to be. And so it's not a counterfactual where I'm thinking about if there was a change, how would markups change in response to the shock. I'm just going to say I'm going to take those markups and exogenously move them to what they need to be in order for me to get efficiency. And then I'm going to measure the gap. So I don't need a theory I don't need to supply the theory of industrial organization, because I'm just going from observed equilibrium to the frontier. And the frontier doesn't require me to supply a theory of industrial organization. It's just sort of a calculation there. Okay, so the losses caused are significant, and they depend on scale elasticities. Here's what happens if you open the door to the entry margin. And basically, the losses kind of double in both cases. Why is that? Well, the reason is because now you're adding a whole bunch of Harberger triangles. And those Harberger triangles that you're adding, they're showing up because these markups are not very close to what we think should be the optimal ones, given our estimates of the returns to product creation. Because the markups, they're coming from things, oh, I'm out of time, that depend on industrial organization, but the value that the firms create have something to do with the area under the demand curve. And in general, these two things are totally unrelated. Okay, the other last thing I want to point out is that in these models, the losses are actually monotone in elasticities of substitution. So a very enduring intuition you might have if you've thought about misallocation models a lot is that the higher is the elasticity of substitution, the bigger is the distance to the frontier. Because the more elastic are quantities to your wedges. In this model, if you plot losses as a function of the elasticity of substitution, it's actually non-monotone. Why? Because the Harberger triangles associated with entry get bigger as the elasticities get lower. And so there's sort of an offsetting effect. But I'm out of time, so I'm going to wrap up. I don't have anything can't say anything about second best stuff, so I'll wrap up. So when you have a model with an inefficient equilibrium, aggregation requires understanding reallocations. That's why inefficient models are complicated to understand. And when you have entry and exit, these can be boiled into changes in rents and quasi-rents. But in general, I think the main thing that we come away from this paper is entry is a very powerful force, and it can completely alter the way you think about these kinds of questions. Thanks very much.